So the topic of this afternoon is about resource politics. I'm not going to go with an attempt of coming up with a clear definition of what we entail by resource politics, but in some ways I'm using this picture perhaps as a starting point of this blue and green earth in some ways, these sort of harmonious colors. And in some ways resource politics perhaps would integrate a bit more red around these colors to reflect some of the sort of conflict, violence, and key trends and processes that are occurring. Obviously, there's really many different ways to understand and approach resource politics, and what we'll do today is just reflect, as part of our own sort of disciplinary background, but trying to go beyond our own disciplinary background, our own understanding and position with respect to the debates. But you could understand it from a political ecology perspective, from STS, anthropology, geography or critical political geography, development studies, and the list could be so much longer. There's so many takes on these issues. There's also another sort of recurring debate, which is also about this idea of, is it about resources or natural resources politics in some ways, and there the debate is whether in some ways natural resources is too much of a sort of constraint in a way of viewing these interactions. Whether natural resources, again, just focuses on one aspect of a relationship between human ecology interaction in some ways. And that's why we opt for a sort of broader understanding of resources that also includes sort of financial dimensions and so on. In some ways, there's also a different sort of standing point and perspective of how to approach the problem. In some ways, whether you start from very much from a sort of grounded approach, talking about the materiality of the resources, or you could start from a different perspective, essentially around how knowledge is constituted and formed, and how discourse are created. In some ways, what we're doing this morning through this sort of group exercise, we're very much starting from the second strand, but in some ways you can start also from the materiality of the resources and how sort of conflict and contestation on the ground are in some ways debated. But I guess the approach we'll try to develop today is to think of resource politics from a longer term perspective. And I think this morning already came out how one needs a sort of much longer term perspective to understand the dynamics of policy process, how discourse are being reproduced and replicated. And in some ways what we want to do in this session is an illustration of how resource politics needs to be understood through a sort of long-term strategy of enclosure, territorialization, and primitive accumulation. And in some ways, how we structured the talk is as follows. In the first part, I'm going to cover, in some ways, how can we rethink resource politics around the lens of violence, conflict, and security. Then Amber is going to talk very much about aspects related to abstraction, commodification, and financialization of nature. All great words to pronounce when you're a French speaker. Thanks, Amber. and then, in some ways, Lila will finish by regrouping these through one key example and thinking of whether we're reaching a sort of critical moment or not around questions of land, green, and water grabs. So that's basically the sort of structure of our presentation. In some ways, I wanted to start with, in doing my talk, I've been inspired by a number of readings, and that's my first go and my first attempt at doing, of looking at it through this sort of violence security perspective. And I got inspired by a number of readings from here. It's from Latour, that's talking about Anthropocene politics and one conflict in the age of the Anthropocene, to other authors like critical geographers like Simon Dalby and so on, to anthropologists like Peluso and so on. So I try to bring really different perspectives into the debate. And I wanted to start with this one because in some ways I think it summarized quite neatly also some of the discussion in terms of sort of positionality, in terms of, you know, how to be both at the same time a researcher or an activist or a researcher or involved in policy process. He comes up with this question, which is in his articles, are we or are we not living at the time of the Anthropocene? And in some ways he argues that, you know, some people that position themselves in the Anthropocene start thinking them as sort of earthbound in the Anthropocene, while those that are still thinking of them in the Holocene still think of them as humans. And what he tries to do with his article is really to sort of politicize debates around this, emphasizing obviously that sort of ecology has suffered from this lack rather than this excess of politicization. And he comes up with this idea that in some ways you have to position yourself at one end of the debate. And in some ways, I think it's quite an illustration of how resource politics can be approached. And he uses very much the language and the metaphors of war and conflicts. And he argues that, you know, only those who have enemies do politics. Only those who are not treating their adversaries as irrational or mad or archaic may begin to equip themselves to win a battle. Sides have to be taken. And in some ways that summarizes very much what I believe one has to do in approaching the topic of resource politics. So let me turn to sort of particular lens, and that's just one lens. Let me just emphasize this. Of thinking of resource politics through violence. And I think this one is deeply problematic in the sense that the debates have very been much narrowed down to a sort of environmental security perspective. There are many problems with this category. The first one is obviously that again and again the link between sort of environment, security and violence is very much narrowed down to issues around scarcity. Very much limited to those that are aware of these debates around greed and grievances or natural resource curse. But the problem, obviously, is that, as one can see from many of these studies, it's not because of resource shortage or resource abundance that this leads to conflict by itself. I took a graph there, I don't know if you can see it, but just a graph that in some ways just represents how influential this thinking is, which is the early work that you are probably aware of Homer Dixon, which was basically trying to think of the relationship between resource scarcity and the social effects, especially in terms of conflict, from ethnic conflicts to deprivation conflicts. And this thinking has been so much imbued in a way that one thinks of resource politics and violence that what I want to do today is to try and propose a much broader perspective and understanding of the logics of violence in terms of resource politics. And I think in some ways that's just one illustration. My background, for some of you that may know me, is essentially water, and each time I say to people that work on water, they say, oh, how fantastic, but you'll be studying the next water wars of the next century. These kind of images are just stuck in the people's mind, and that's the first thing that comes to their mind. And as I said, I think it can be really traced back to these ideas of scarcity and their relationship with conflict. That, you know, this little picture obviously represents the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance dams. And again, the spectres of water wars are coming again. But in some ways, as we can see, there's never been really sort of water wars if defined around transboundary issues and transboundary water conflicts. what you can see is essentially declaration of intents, but it has never been followed by military action. That's basically a word cloud that I took from The Economist. They've got a sort of a page that's specifically focusing on water. And I just basically put all the text together, and that's the sort of word cloud that it produced. Again, that's another illustration of the sort of pessimistic view that one associated with particular resources. So you got, again, interestingly, scarcity doesn't come out, but you got notions of crisis, you got notions of droughts, you got a very negative understanding that comes out. There were images, of course, on the website that I've used. There I used them selectively. It's not a representation of all the images. But, you know, when the association of water with disastrous event is obviously repeated through different types of pictures, whether through the use of graphs or sort of dramatic pictures, or even messages. I think that's in Australia, where you can see this message that says, serious drought helped save water. So you got these association. But in some ways, what I want to emphasize in my talk today is that the resource politics and violence is very much blind to the sort of everyday structural violences and conflict stemming from state and economic forces. So it's not just about this narrow understanding of scarcity and conflict, but it's very much understanding it from a much broader historical perspective, thinking of, you know, on the first hand, on the reshaping of territories, nation-state building. For example, I did my PhD on what I term water nationalism, which was looking at how nation-making and state-building processes impacted on how transboundary water resources were shared. So, you know, even going back to our geographical textbook, how we think of our rivers as part of our identity and ourselves. So, in some ways, you can have a much deeper historical understanding of these sort of processes of territorialization. And obviously, these are built into much broader process of international political economy and of the expansion of sort of national integration into international markets. Another way, of course, to look at it is this notion of sort of empires, which is a sort of an old notion, sort of in some ways coming back. Sort of metropolitan cities, you know, from London to New York, rather than thinking of the UK, you're thinking rather of these cities and the way they are having an impact on the sort of new frontiers of the sort of global economy. So in some ways, what's quite interesting is to look at it at whether we are reaching, again, a sort of turning point. Obviously, as you can see from the nature of my talk, I'm emphasizing much more sort of long-term continuity rather than a particular shift or a particular shock in the system that would transform it. But in some ways, the sort of framing of global security linked to particular resources has particularly evolved. Of course, oil has been a sort of security concern, you know, since the 70s, with the different oil shock and how, you know, oil became part of the sort of new geopolitics, to reaching different levels of global security, now talking very much about Anthropocene and climate security, and also sort of migration challenges. These were highlighted in the 2004 high-level panel on threat, challenges, and change. And in some ways, I've picked up this statement, I forgot from which one of my reading, although people that are quite critical, but that are in some ways reflecting on how we are reaching another stage and how humans are affecting the capacity of the Earth system and transformation that ensures. And I think my point on this is that one has to be really careful about the sort of security implication of these sort of perceived environmental disruptions. There's been many debates over the summer school over, you know, what are tipping points, what are the range of these tipping points, and so on. And obviously, one has to to put in context and in some ways engage with the debate and refrain from an agenda of danger and a mapping of fear. And really think in some ways of rather than thinking of the sort of resources per se, also their interaction with sort of industrial and economic process linked to sort of urbanity and so on. There are other types of crisis. There's the famous word of John Beddington, who was the former scientific advisor to the UK government. We termed it the sort of perfect storm. Basically, the interaction between multiple internet global crises, rather than thinking of them of just one crisis around climate change, another one around food scarcity. It's very much the relationship between all of these and the effects that these have, from climate change to energy to food to economic stability. Leading rise to sort of policy concepts that one can discuss a bit later around the Nexus and so on. Also, there's other dynamics obviously linked to the sort of new green economy, and in some ways I think it's important, but Lila and Amber will go more in detail about this. To what extent these are new, and in some ways they're rebranding existing land struggles, but also generate new conflict because of the policy schemes that are put in place. And you've got other new frontiers, obviously, around carbon, around biofuels, and so on, that are creating these cycles of conflict and violence. So in some ways, as you can see from my talk, what I'm trying to do is sort of historicize the relationship between resources, conflict, and violence, ranging back, if you like, to the sort of pre-existing sort of colonial violence. And think of violence around sort of the process of enclosure. There's been a lot of talk around this idea of land frontiers. You just have to study the history of the US or Australia and so on, and these ideas of land frontiers and how the state expanded against a particular so-called indigenous people in these states. But it's much broader than this. Obviously, you can talk about forest, and that's the work of Peluso and Van der Gaast around this notion of political forest, but more largely around this idea of environmental territories, how you got a transformation of these territories and how they get territorialized. Forest, national parks, and protected areas, and so on. Just to give you a few examples. And in some ways, as I said, you got different lenses. I'm not pretending of giving a specific periodization, because these different lenses, from statalization to sort of empires to the new geopolitics of the Anthropocene, are all happening as sort of parallel processes. So don't read a chronology in what I'm presenting here. But in some ways, I've talked about sort of state territorialization and securitization in some ways. So the larger process of integrating the sort of rural people into sort of national politics and economic structures. Peluso, in her article essentially on forest, argues that it's very similar to sort of counter-insurgency techniques. So break up villages, isolation, and integrate villages into state politics and economy. James Scott also refers to transformation of just the political categories of forests, where nature are transformed into natural resources. And in some ways, you can go back to the sort of origin of the terminology to see this kind of transformation, basically in order to sort of secure state revenues and development. That's one lens. So I just picked up a quote from Peluso and Van der Gaast. Basically argues that the ideologies and institutional practices associated with the conservation area of romantic notions of preserving rainforest, primary forest, and pristine forest were both preceded and enabled by this earlier violent period by which the jungles are made into primary forest or divided between political forest and agriculture. Another one is very much linked to this idea of I picked this idea of Simon Dalby that came up with a impossible to pronounce, globalization, I guess, globalization. But anyway, and empires, which is much more about seeing how sort of imperial centers and the relationship between sort of centers and periphery around an empire, and the sort of consequences of industrial production, resulting in obviously appropriation and displacement. The last one, which is essentially around the sort of geopolitics of the Anthropocene, I think comes up with a number of challenges for us as thinkers, and also particularly as I've put social scientists, but not just limited to these categories. In some ways, us as sort of urban residents. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, we've been quite critical of the sort of Anthropocene, but it challenges this very old assumption that has been challenged again. But I think it's quite an important one of this notion of untouched and unpolluted nature as the basis for sort of environmental ethics. And I think what's interesting is that it goes beyond the sort of very narrow resource politics also of what we could call a cartography of resource conflicts. So just placing a map and just placing all and just thinking of the relationship and rivalries between different actors around this particular resource, rather than linking it through a larger system and view in some ways. In some ways, what are the different forms of resource violence? And I think that what's quite interesting is that you've got a sort of process of militarization that is very much occurring with some of these, where you can see the sort of privatization of security that happens at the same time through the use of private armies and security forces. You've got two good examples. The first one is around sort of resource extraction and enclaves. And sort of James Ferguson work on sort of enclave and seeing like an oil company. Quite interesting of how the idea of enclaves and the sort of militarization that goes with it. But the same is true, obviously, of sort of resource conservation. You got work by sort of Rosalind Duffy and many others that shows how sort of conservation becomes militarized with sort of forestry officers and sort of anti-poaching and so on. So you got this sort of larger processes occurring. And it's important to place this larger historical perspective, because otherwise you take these concepts like new concept like the Nexus as just a form of apolitical concepts, as just a form of greater integration there's nothing wrong with the concept in itself if you look at it, that calls for greater integration behind this. But what's the reality of around Nexus, and what are the implications of these kind of approaches? So in some ways, this, and it's a nice link with Amber, does the growing marketization of water, food, energy and climate help to enhance local well-being and rights? Or again, are these processes allowing new actors to increase processes of enclosure and common? So that's, in some ways, if you put some of these key concepts within a historical perspective, you can bring back these kinds of debate rather than a very narrow understanding of resource politics and violence.
I'm going to continue the talk that Jeremy began by talking a little bit about the area of resource politics that I've been engaging in lately, and that's really the financialization of nature and natural resources. Thinking about resource politics to me is really about thinking about struggles over resources and value. And these struggles, of course, they cross scales and jurisdictional levels. And it's really interesting to think about them because of the complexity of these struggles. And it's also incredibly important to think about it because of all that's at stake. So first I'm going to talk just about a little bit about financialization. So I use a lot of $20 words out of necessity in my research, but financialization, just as an introduction, it's a term that describes any sort of economic system or process that attempts to reduce value that's to be exchanged into a financial instrument, some sort of tradable unit. This might be tangible things or intangible things, promises, as long as they can be reduced into a unit that can be traded. Basically, that's what a financial instrument is, implicated in the process of financialization. Specifically, when we're talking about the financialization of nature or the financialization of natural resources, what we're talking about is sets of techniques, some of which are very sophisticated, some of which are still being developed and will be developed in the future, for bringing non-market natural phenomena in line with market logics and processes. Specifically, the logics and processes associated with global financial markets. In terms of the kind of local end or place-based end of financialization, we can talk about bringing issues of conservation and environmental governance, place-focused environmental governance, into the financial sphere, and vice versa. So it's not just a one-way kind of flow or application. Financialization involves a lot of overlapping processes. So a lot of times terms like privatization, commercialization, commodification, and financialization get all lumped together. But really, these are different processes that often work together. They're nonlinear, and they can contribute to kind of broader processes of linking non-market things to financial markets. And so basically, when you're talking about financialization, specifically, I think a good way to think of it is a transformation in which commercialized value embodied in a natural product or service is abstracted as an easily traded financial instrument. But of course, if you look at the literature and you talk about the financialization of nature, the financialization of any other aspect of life or non-market good, you're going to see variable definitions of that process. But I just wanted to kind of give you a primer on that. So when we're talking about nature financialization, we can talk about all sorts of environmental functions that can become subject to this kind of financial abstraction or abstraction and commodification. In this process, what we're, just to basically model it, I guess, we can think of intact ecosystems, places. These might be national parks or, particular valued forests that are set aside. Intact ecosystems that are kind of envisioned as natural capital, as a sort of asset that belongs to a country or a part of a country that gives rise to particular services. So here I've just listed a variety of environmental functions that can be subject to financialization. So terrestrial biodiversity and its functions, marine biodiversity and its functions, water purification services, forest carbon sequestration, marine carbon sequestration, coastal carbon sequestration, erosion control services, coastal protection services. We can think of air purification, just about any kind of crucial environmental thing that allows us to survive as humans can actually be kind of grouped in this category of environmental functions that can be subject to financialization, as long as they can be assessed in a way that makes them packageable as financial instruments, credits, offsets, derivatives, things like that. So really, when we're talking about financialization of natural resources, this is kind of, in a very broad sense, a process that gives rise to natural resource commodities and specifically financialized environmental goods and services. But really, this process is all about kind of capturing the value that we or certain people see as represented in intact ecosystems. Specifically, those who prefer to think of intact ecosystems as representing some sort of natural capital asset that should give rise to some sort of tradable commodity. So resource financialization has actually been around for a while, a recent while. So the first kind of things that you could think of as, big time resource financialization projects happened with wetlands banking and endangered species banking in the 1980s in the United States. And various projects have and programs have been enacted that involve these principles for quite some time. But nothing has really come together at the scale of what's called the green economy. Is this a familiar term to everybody? Probably so. I mean, lots of greening and talking of the green economy when we think about development today, because it's really become a very important paradigm in development, and specifically around sustainable development. And ideas in the green economy actually have a really key role in contemporary notions of sustainability that are organized around the idea of not just making sure that the environment is has integrity in the long term, but making sure that the environment can work to support itself economically, and also that in turn the global economy will work to support the environment. It's kind of a central notion to these kind of new ideas of sustainability from this kind of green economy lens. So as you know, as it is now, it's a policy package really. When you're talking about the green economy, it's a policy package, a really flexible policy package originating from really the UN Environment Program angle, but involving a lot of partnerships and collaborations. But it's conceived of as a flexible policy toolkit that really combines principles of economic growth and environmental mitigation in the context of climate change crises. This toolkit contains things like command and control environmental regulations, recommendations for multi-sectoral reforms across all sectors really, resource efficient technology, renewable energy, forestry, recommendations for land use programs to balance emissions, and recommendations for developing and contributing to markets and developing market-like instruments for trading in these financialized environmental products that are derived from intact natural capital assets. So not all aspects of the green economy are specifically oriented around nature financialization, but what they are all linked to is the concept of mitigation. Mitigation in terms of reducing and preventing greenhouse gas emissions, which also involves displacing and trading liability for greenhouse gas emissions that do occur. So that concept of mitigation is something that links like low carbon transport infrastructure to things like financialization programs. So they're not just sitting apart from one another, they're really quite connected. And they come together in the context of the crises of the 21st century. And one of these big crises that we've all experienced is the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009, however you want to account for it. And the other, of course, is looming environmental crisis. Now, in terms of thinking about the green economy as this big flexible policy toolkit, part of its compelling message, part of its branding, is it brands itself on the proposed, what they call triple win of the green economy. And this triple win basically represents sustained economic growth, environmental sustainability, and poverty alleviation by applying green economy principles and inclusive growth principles to development programming. So basically, we're not just talking about a win-win, but a win-win-win in all potential contexts as long as the principles are followed. Now, of course, this being a relatively new, really post-2012, set of policy ideas, policy toolkit, it's of course still quite experimental, and the triple win claims of the green economy really do need to be tested. So far, there's not very much evidence for the triple win in particular project evaluations, but I guess we have yet to see. Now, within this green economy policy structure, basically, I mean, we're talking about developing a system internationally. We have basically three different categories of actors. So we have the UN system and multilateral development banks as one kind of group that we're talking about. We have private sector partners, and we have the public sector. And according to the United Nations documents that really kind of brought these ideas of the green economy together in the run-up to 2012, these are the three primary groups of actors involved in the green economy. The roles and responsibilities of the UN system and multilateral development banks are to basically provide technical advice and support, to provide the ideas and the recommendations for reforms. The private sector has an important role of investing and innovating. The public sector, which includes national, subnational, and local governments, basically has the majority of the responsibilities in realizing these reforms and attracting investment, ensuring that policy reform happens, mainstreaming or environmental mainstreaming, ensuring that environmental principles get integrated into all areas of policymaking, capacity building to realize this in practice, ensuring safety or a safe environment for investors, low risk environment for investors, and managing and accounting for actual resources upon which these resource-based financial instruments are created. So, and it's actually quite complex, even though this might look like just a straightforward set of roles and responsibility. There's a lot of collaboration and work across groups that has to happen in order to fund and apply reforms and come up with the appropriate reforms for particular contexts in the context of regional level planning, existing national level environmental programs, and existing protected area networks and particular protected areas that a lot of these programs are built on. So just to give you an idea of the complexity, this is just the partners that were listed as being involved in, what's it called? There's so many coalitions. The Green Economy Coalition, actually. So this isn't the full exhaustive list, but the who of the green economy, including roles, responsibilities for funding, for coming up with policy recommendations, for carrying out things, is very complicated. Now here's the rest of them. And actually, Step Center is a partner in this too. But the green economy really involves diverse networks, including, it includes research institutes, it includes universities, governments, environmental NGOs, private corporations, banks, bankers, intergovernmental organizations. I'm doing research around the SADC right now, civil society organizations, and a lot of other types of groups of stakeholders. So it's quite complex when you actually start getting to the nitty-gritty of policy production here and consensus seeking and things like that. So let's say you're creating financial instruments. Earlier on I said financialization is, in a way it's about connecting place-based resources with global environmental markets by creating new kind of avenues for capital investment. And a big way that this happens under the green economy reforms, it's actually a continuation from previous environmental policy phases, international environmental policy. But it does this really through the creation of emissions markets and mechanisms that link these place-based systems to the global kind of market. A big one of these is, of course, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, plus conservation and sustainable development, or REDD or REDD+. This is one of the particular mechanisms that's heavily implicated in green economy reforms that are directly related to the financialization of natural resources. Other examples are the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of three basic finance mechanism or flexibility mechanisms that are part of the Kyoto Protocol that basically sets up types of mitigation relationships between countries. So you can have particular projects in, let's say, a lesser developed country, selling credits to a particular company or organization or, even county or city in a more developed context in order to offset greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be a familiar concept to a lot of people. I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual foundations. I mean, this is the STEP summer school, so thinking about narratives and pathways I think is important when we're thinking about policy. So the intellectual foundations of the green economy approach, this mitigation-oriented, heavily dependent on financialization approach, include, really conventional growth-oriented development economics, environmental economics, and ecological economics. Now, environmental economics and ecological economics are not the same thing. Environmental economics tends to apply the principles of economics to studying how environmental and natural processes can be developed and managed, whereas ecological economics deals more with relationships between natural systems and economies over time and things like that. But the green economy has been very heavily influenced by development economics and environmental economics, to a lesser extent by ecological economics, but ecological economics has given the green economy some very important concepts, like ecological limits, like the concept of natural capital, like the idea of the global commons or ideas about the global commons and things like that. So basically the dominant framing of the green economy, which really comes from this kind of foundational work, Blueprint for a Green Economy, that was published in 1989, is that economy, environment, and society are basically kind of discrete and distinguishable domains, and nature and natural processes have traditionally been this kind of neglected domain of a world that's ultimately governed by markets and market principles. So this is kind of the kind of philosophical framing on which a lot of green economy policy is ultimately drawing from. Now, basically, there is, kind of a coherent policy narrative embodied in the green economy and in ideas of green growth. You can, if you read these policy documents and read articles about valuing natural assets and the importance of doing that effectively, you'll see a definite problem laid out, that economic growth and environmental sustainability are at odds, are fundamentally at odds because of market failures, basically. That environmental preservation and economic growth can be compatible policy objectives, but only when environmental assets and functions are priced correctly. So if environmental functions, and this leads to the result, if environmental functions that sustain us and keep us alive are not priced correctly, if they're essentially free to use, then what the result is a global, basically, tragedy of the commons, in which people overexploit common pool resources and degrade the environment because they don't value it properly in their decisions that they make about resource use. So following this narrative, this framing, if environmental services like clean water, clean air, erosion control, coastal protection, all these things that I mentioned earlier are free of charge, they, in addition to being prone to degrading behavior, they also won't receive policy attention. And proponents of green economy reforms contend that these market failures can be resolved by effectively accounting for and accurately pricing natural assets and functions. As a result of this, the outcome of the appropriate level of intervention will be a correction of these market failures, resulting in global policy transitions that can achieve sustainable economic growth that's socially inclusive, pro-poor, universal, and in fact it must be universal. It must be like a cumulative transition, but it must also be flexible, realizing that not every, let's say, country can necessarily put the same sorts of policies or the same flavor of policies into effect as others. And I just highlighted here the aspects of this that touch on the triple win promise that we talked about earlier. So just to sum up a little bit, while the conceptual origins of the green economy really lie in the 1980s, we didn't see a massive policy uptake of ideas around financialization and mitigation through financialization, especially until the 21st century. And this was due to a lot of factors. And a lot of these factors are going to be things that we've lived with throughout our lives, like international policy trends and agreements since the 1990s regarding sustainability and climate change. And these include the outcomes and policy work that's been done since of the UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, things like Agenda 21, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol that extended it. There's been lots of work on environmental mainstreaming and development policies. There's been a lot of other stuff related to finance, like increasing importance of private finance to conservation and development. the series of financial booms and busts throughout the 2000s. Like, these are all things that we've been cognizant of through our whole lives, and they've been really important to shaping the contemporary kind of landscape of, what environmental possibilities or what are seen as feasible possibilities for environmental and economic remedy. But yeah, like I said before, the green economy really coalesced around 2012, around the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, also called Rio 20, and it really became an organizing brand for global socio-environmental transitions toward a particular type of sustainability, what I said before, that in which nature has to be managed in order to be productive, and it must work and like kind of do labor conceptually in order to earn its preservation. Now, coming out of this, there are a lot of emerging issues, and definitely linkages to what Jeremy was talking about with global securitization of resources, in terms of thinking about what's going on outside of this kind of global or international policy discourse level. There's a lot of complexity at the intersection of local histories and policy histories. So understanding what's going on at the kind of social, political, conservation, value, policy intersection in these processes of transition, I think is really key to understanding struggles over value that are being played out across levels and scales, and also issues of equity and inequality. So these are really big issues, and it connects to what Lila's going to be talking about around land and water grabs. But really, there are really big issues related to things like equity and increasing inequalities, because when you're talking about financializing basically place-based resources, you have to have control over places in order to control or attempt to manage the ecological value that's embodied in them, basically. So you see big trends in shifting rights and control over resources and landscapes, particularly in poorer countries in the world or lower income countries. And this highlights issues of labor accumulation, grabbing, and issues like Jeremy said of enclosure, territorialization, potentials for conflict, violence and abuses of power. And amidst all this, of course, there are governance challenges, environmental management challenges. And there are a lot of critics of financialization and green economy reforms. And one of the big questions that keeps getting asked and debated is, is financialization and, on a bigger scale, kind of green economy proposals a resolution for global economic and environmental crises, or kind of a way or a pathway that's going to lead to more kind of unfolding problems than solutions. So that's just a question to leave you with.
So it sort of carries on with the theme of enclosures and dispossession. And I think the land grab or the water grab, whatever grab, resource grab debate is really very central to the issue of resource politics in many ways. I've been working on resource politics for a long time. I mean, if you can look at it in terms of contested access and claims over resources, but not just the materiality of the resource, not just in terms of material access, but also in terms of knowledge claims, contested knowledge claims in the way we view resources, in terms of control, etc. So it moves across a whole arenas, lots of arenas. So land grabbing, as I said, Amber's already mentioned the sort of triple crisis of 2008, 2009, the crisis of land, food, climate, and around that a lot of things were happening. It's sort of known in academic discourse around land grabbing, but there are lots of different terminology to understand this phenomenon that took place. The land rush, large-scale land acquisitions, a rising interest in farmland. Others have called it sort of agricultural investment that's much needed to enhance growth, productivity, or indeed land deals. It is a political terminology to use the word grab, and in some ways the term grabbing raises very disturbing memories of past enclosures and dispossessions. And this is intended because the term grabbing is intended to grab attention, and to direct it towards a new twist in the sort of process of enclosures, towards a present-day injustice. So if we hadn't used the term grab, actually, if the term grabbing hadn't been used, maybe today's cycle of land, water, green grabbing may have gone invisible. So in some ways, but it's still very, very difficult to understand what we understand or what we mean by land grabbing. Now, a whole host of actors and constellations have taken place, and drivers and actors in and enabling these different land acquisitions, deals, processes to take place. Asian powers seeking to secure food supply elsewhere, the movement and actions of oil-rich but land and water-poor Gulf states, for example, moving and seeking new frontiers, largely in different parts of Africa. European and North American banks, financiers, sovereign funds, responding to the financial crisis. This is what Amber has already spoken about. The BRICS, emerging economies asserting themselves and moving elsewhere, China, Brazil, India, etc. We've already heard about green growth, green economy from Amber. I mean, that was also part of this process. And a lot of these actors and drivers were acting in partnership with governments and or domestic partners. And so that's why in some ways a lot of people have said, how can you call it a grab? Because in some ways a lot of these processes are extremely legal. You have domestic players, you have national governments that open up. So the grab is more about what's actually happening, the process of dispossession, the reallocation of crucial resources. And why it's classic resource politics for me, because in some ways these landscapes that you see here mean different things to different actors. So this picture here before, herder in a forest, a lot of people would call this landscape marginal, underutilized. This pastoralist obviously would have no formal rights. So the rights of these people are in informal systems, so they're largely invisible. Whatever they produce is also largely invisible because it's never accounted in formal systems. And so this is a marginal landscape that needs to be transformed to something like that. This crop means many, many different things to many people. So jatropha, many years ago, was this future, the crop for the future, where we'd create energy. But obviously, there's been all sorts of competing claims around what it means for local food security, what it means for local livelihoods, etc. And indeed, also its environmental costs. How much water does it need, for example? What happens to the land after you have this, as opposed to something that's more multiple like that? So contested meanings around the same landscape, and indeed transformations of the landscape. So how do you theorize a lot of these processes? Resource grabbing in general broadly refers to the appropriation of natural resources, including land and water, and the control of their associated use and benefits with or without the transfer of ownership. It usually moves from poor and marginalized to powerful actors. So a lot of the critical work has largely focused and drawn on political economy and Marxist traditions, in particular David Harvey's notion of accumulation by dispossession. But there are also other conceptions. For example, Karen Backer quotes the enclosure of public assets by private interests for profit, resulting in greater social inequity. So it's just different ways of making sense of this process. Amber's already spoken about the processes of privatization, financialization. I won't really mention that anymore. But what's very important is I think this debate really came on, if you look at the trends in resource politics, we had a long period where there was a lot of focus on the discursive. So political ecology really focused and tried to marry political economy with post-structuralist trends in social science. So really looking at contested knowledge claims, looking at contested claims around how you understand the resource. So as I said, it's the grabbing stuff really brought back Marxist analysis into this debate, because political ecology had married political economy, and it had a very strong post-structuralist turn also, which was very useful. But I think through the grabbing debate, you had this sort of Marxist discussion come back in, and it really became very, very important. Land grabbing and water grabbing, resource grabbing, is also control grabbing, and that's a very central concept. capturing the power to control resources and how they're used in order to corner the benefits. So in that sense, you're not just looking at, who's capturing this land here, but actually who's getting the benefits out of it. And with a resource like water, it's particularly important because water is a fluid, slippery resource, and benefits and harms move upstream, downstream. There's all sorts of surface groundwater interactions, and in that sense, looking at benefits and control is sort of more important. And control grabbing is a very contingent process. It's marked by conflict, by negotiation and friction, and it can ratify existing balance of power by state and non-state actors in very many different ways. And it's important to note, especially when you start looking at other resources, not just land, that it's not just about agriculture. You have to go beyond agriculture, and especially because I've worked on water grabbing, agriculture matters, but it's not just that. It's also in different sectors. It's mining, it's energy, it's control of, and it's very difficult to point out what exactly is being grabbed and by whom and when. And so now let me just give you some examples about the water grab. As I said, a lot of headline attentions to land grabbing did not really focus much on other resources. It was all about the actual material, fixed land. But often water, it was found, is that water was a hidden agenda of the so-called land grab, and many people then said that behind every lot of sort of land grab that you have, there is a water grab. This is because water is often a hidden agenda. People get the land, and that way they get control over water or the benefits around water. And as I've already argued, there are very powerful narratives around scarcity and abundance. A lot of my work has been to denaturalize scarcity, to really point out the fact that scarcity is deeply political. It's not something that's out there, that's natural. And in that sense, you really question the argument that the land is marginal or water is abundant. I mean, these are just narratives to justify these processes. But usually that's not the case at all. So the water grab is actually quite complicated. And I said it's very difficult to understand what's being grabbed. This is because of fluctuating availability across time and space. Sort of varied impacts in terms of distribution, even on water quality. So you could be doing something somewhere, and downstream effects could be pollution, and that in some ways is also part of a grab and a reappropriation of water, and dislocated effects and impacts of the grab. And we're already talking about a very contested resource from, its very outset. It's molded by unequal access. It's molded by unequal power relations. But then these processes intensify that. All the grabs, be they land grabs, green grabs, water grabs, they take place through a multiplicity of processes. As I said, often there's a lot of policy obscurity, so people can justify these processes because often they can use policies in different ways. And the policy process, as we heard this morning, is shaped by particular actors, by particular interests. In many cases, especially around water, when you're looking at mining or hydropower, you find sectoral reform and a redefinition of laws also facilitates grabs to take place, to allow the state to or corporate actors to access resources in particular ways. You're talking about a coalition of different interests and actors. And it's wrong to just say these are all foreign players. Very often domestic players benefit a lot. There's an active role of the state. And indeed, a lot of local people could also benefit in different ways. The complexities around tenure also enable these processes to take place. I already mentioned the fact that we're talking about a lot of people who have their rights in customary law, and these rights are largely unrecognized, and so that enables big players to capture resources, to grab resources. We're talking about a complex intertwining between water and land rights, and a lot of complexities around negotiations, compensation, poor environmental and social impacts, etc. And so what you have across the board, and there is lots and lots of, there's a whole politics of data, what is actually happening, how many millions of hectares have been transferred, but you're having significant reappropriation of resources, significant changes in water, in land tenure relations. A lot of impacts in terms of people's basic rights and access to resources, And a lot of diversion and consumption of large amounts of water, of land changes, there's lots of data around it. And indeed, in a lot of these cases, I did a special issue for water alternatives together with colleagues, and we found in many of these cases, be they in Asia, in different parts of Latin America, Africa, you have both covert and overt forms of resistance. There are some spaces where there is potential for change, but very often that is subverted, because of assertions of power, etc. So to wrap up, when I looked at both water and land grabs together, obviously both were shaped by unequal power relations. Both happen because there are unclear distinctions between legality and illegality, as well as formal and informal rights. And both of them are fraught with sort of very tricky licensing and negotiation processes. But the water grab was a more fuzzy process, and in some ways we said it was nice to look at it as a very slippery, it's more slippery in some ways. It's more slippery, it's more fuzzy, because we're talking about a fluid resource that's very difficult to manage and control. There are very unclear administrative boundaries and jurisdictions, dislocation of effects upstream, downstream, because of surface and groundwater interactions, and a lot of fluctuations in availability over time and space. So this is something that's still unfolding, that's difficult to understand, and it's part of this historical wider process, but something distinct that's happening right now. Thanks.